Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Catón. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is presented by the German Maritime Center. To find out more about the center, go to maritime.center. You can also find the link in the show notes. Our guest today is Dr. Deborah Elms, the head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore. Deborah is one of the most recognized voices on trade policy in the Asia-Pacific region. And before joining the Hinrich Foundation, she founded and led the Asian Trade Center, which is a consultancy working with governments and companies on trade policy design. She has held advisory roles at the highest level of international trade governance, including on the board of the Trade and Investment Negotiation Advisor at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific, and also as a member of the World Economic Forum's Trade and Investment Council. Deborah holds a PhD in political science from the University of Washington and a master's in international relations from the University of Southern California. She is the author of numerous articles and the editor of several books and a frequent commentator on trade and economic issues in major media outlets around the world. Deborah, welcome to Business Diplomacy Today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Deborah, before we dive into the big geopolitical questions, I'd like to start with your organization, the Hinrich Foundation. It describes itself as a philanthropic organization advancing sustainable global trade through research and education. Now, usually trade policy is something that sounds like it's happening behind closed doors. It's something for wonks and other people who are interested in technical minutiae and very kind of arcane things. What is the mandate of the Hinrich Foundation, and why does it matter for a wider audience maybe than some economists specializing on trade?
Well, I think it goes back to the origin of the Hinrich Foundation. It comes from Merle Hinrich, who is an interesting entrepreneur, founded multiple incredibly successful businesses doing trade, particularly with Asia to the United States. So he was out in 60 years ago, actually, in Japan and Korea, and then moved very early, as a Westerner, moved very early into China, connecting Chinese companies with American buyers. And I think his own lived experience is that trade matters. It makes a big difference for jobs, for livelihood. It obviously affects consumer opportunities. And so as part of his philanthropy to give back, he founded the foundation, the Hinrich Foundation with his name on it, to make sure that trade continues going forward. And especially for him, what's important is to make sure that it's grounded in research and that it's supported by students and other educators to try to make sure that everyone understands that trade does make a difference in a way that can be positive.
I would be interested in hearing why you switched a little bit sides or focus area, because you were one of those wonks, if I may say so. You worked in the world of governance and policy, international organizations at the UN and so on and so forth. Why did you decide to change and switch to research and education in this foundation?
Well, I had a long interest in research. In particular, I was a professor for a lot of years. So I was an academic, and I went from being an academic to being someone who, when I first got to Singapore in 2005, ended up doing a lot of work with governments around the region, helping them understand trade, helping them understand how to do a better job of negotiating on trade. And then I realized that particularly here in Asia, especially at that time, more than 20 years ago, there weren't as many companies who were prepared to talk to governments about what they needed. And so we ended up with this weird situation in Asia where governments would be very busy, very excited at negotiating stuff, and businesses would be busy doing business. But the two sides didn't really talk, and we ended up with very bizarre outcomes where government would fight to the death over some provision that actually business didn't really care much about at all. And the things that business often cared about, government had no idea that those were even a priority. So then I switched and I started my own company to work between governments and businesses. And I ran that for almost a decade. And then when Merle Hinrich approached me about joining the foundation, I thought, well, this is an interesting opportunity for me to step back a bit from the day-to-day grind of running your own business and funding and proposals and all of that, and spend more time, again, big picture, thinking about where are we headed on trade. When I came here 2.5 years ago, I mean, that was obviously an interesting question. But in the 2.5 years since I've been here, and especially in the last year, it has become existential. Where is trade going? How is it adjusting? What are the stresses and strains in the system that we have? How are we going to collaborate to figure out how to move forward in some ways? And so I think it's been an interesting journey in general and a particularly interesting time to be in Asia.
The pace of global disruption seems to be accelerating. That is almost a cliche because it's being mentioned in almost every speech that you can listen to at global conferences. But it seems that for businesses, trade policy is now at least a major source of disruption as well, not least because it seems at least that it has become more politicized than it maybe was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Do you have the impression that companies are waking up to that and that they are starting to be better prepared to engage in this dialogue that you mentioned, but also to anticipate some of the fallouts that can come from that disruption?
No. I think there are companies who recognize that the world has changed and who are appreciating that they need to be far more engaged on these issues. So you see this stampede to focus more on risks, to think more about geopolitics, to think more about economics and security. Obviously, in addition to what the Trump administration in the U.S. has done on trade and tariffs, there's what's going on in the Straits of Hormuz, which reminds everybody once again that trade can be easily disrupted. But knowing that and actually doing something about it are two different things. And so I think we're at the early stages of a rupture in trade, and we are not yet ready to build for the future. So we're in this interesting period where what we have known and what companies have known for all of their lives is breaking or has broken, but we haven't built yet for the future. So we have the legacy systems that are in place, some of which are working just fine and need to be salvaged, some of which need to be perhaps revised, some need to be jettisoned. But we don't know what that will look like yet. And I think the big challenge for companies, as with governments actually, is where do we even have those conversations? What do we need to focus on? You can have a sort of deer in the headlights reaction to this, which is like, oh, the world is complicated and difficult, but that's not my problem. I just need to focus on my small corner of the world. Except that the world doesn't actually stay in its corner of the world. It tends to invade your corner of the world, and all of a sudden businesses keep getting caught out by changes that they might have been better prepared for or might have been better able to address than they are currently.
There's also the time issue, right? Traditionally, trade negotiations moved at a very glacial pace. Some of the agreements have been in the making for decades, literally. Some have recently been concluded, but it was very, very slow. Now it's almost by the hour. We might, after this session, we might go back to check where the tariffs are right now, and maybe they're at a different level. And of course, I'm making reference particularly to the U.S. administration than they were before, but things are much more volatile, I guess.
I think we are headed into a much more complicated global environment than we have been used to. We have been used to a system of being able to literally have just-in-time production networks, for example, where goods actually arrive on an assembly line plus or minus 4 hours. And these are global assembly lines, right? So if the ship doesn't come in exactly when intended and doesn't get delivered exactly when intended, plus or minus 4 hours, the factory shuts down. We've been very comfortable with that environment because it appeared to be the most efficient and the most effective way to structure yourself. That no longer works. Or if it does work, it has real risks attached to it. And again, I think we're at the early stages of figuring out if you can't do that, if you can't run a global operation plus or minus 4 hours, well, is it plus or minus 24 hours? Is it plus or minus 3 days? Is it plus or minus 3 weeks? Is it never? We just don't know. And of course, the answer for every company is going to be slightly different. And the reaction from a lot of businesses is to either proceed as though the world hasn't changed much, maybe make some sort of tweaks around the edges, but basically the world is as it was. Or alternatively, the world is so different that you're just sort of paralyzed and you make very few decisions. And I think both of those scenarios are extremely uncomfortable for businesses. Governments are in a similar kind of state of confusion over the speed with which many of these changes are happening and hampered by their own, I would argue, lack of imagination about what are the actual risks and what are the potential opportunities that they have in front of them to make a different world for all of us going forward from 2026 onwards.
At the Hinrich Foundation, you talk a lot about sustainable trade. Now, sustainability is one of these words that means something slightly different to everyone you talk about. So in your definition, or the definition of the foundation, what does that mean, sustainable trade?
So we have a really, I would argue, unusual definition for this sustainable trade, by which they mean able to be sustained. So this is not necessarily about green or climate. It's really about how do you create trade patterns, trade expectations, investment decisions, whatever it happens to be, that can be sustained into the future. That may include climate, just to be clear. We do some research that gets done across our various authors and so forth on sustainability in the traditional sense around green, climate, et cetera. But the overall foundation is really about how do we make sure that trade continues in one form or another. And then the goal in part is to understand what do those trade flows look like, and then how potentially could you make them better, whatever definitions you wanted to use for better. Is that better job opportunities or better investment opportunities? Is that better jobs for people? The definition of what it means to be better, I think, is flexible, and it is one of the benefits, I would argue, of being an independent foundation, is that we don't have to have alignment around what exactly we mean, as long as you're thinking about where is trade today, where might it go in the future, what are the issues that need to be considered, how can we especially bring data to that conversation, how can we make sure that people are making arguments that are grounded in the existing conditions, rather than just sort of a hypothetical 30,000-foot level view of trade. And then what can we do to make trade better going forward?
So you went back to the original definition of sustainability, I guess, from a linguistic perspective. This idea of being sustainable in the sense of being able to sustain itself, I guess, has to come or has to do a lot with being fair or equitable. So in the sense that every partner involved sees some kind of benefit or receives some kind of benefit from trade, I suppose, right? Because if
I think so, as long as we're not arguing that everybody has to be equally beneficial, right? Because that is impossible to achieve. You know, one of the flagship products from our foundation is something that we have called the Sustainable Trade Index. And the idea there is to highlight trade-offs that governments face, because this is an index of governments. So what are the trade-offs that governments face across different categories, some of which are environmental, some of which are societal, some of which are straight-up economic indicators? And what I think is useful about the Sustainable Trade Index is that it does remind you that this is a complicated system that we live in. And you can be extremely good at one area, whether it's, social, cultural, or whether it's environmental, or whether it's just straight up economics, but not so good at the others. And again, there's a sort of trade-off there that governments have to decide upon, hopefully in collaboration with their domestic stakeholders. What is it that works best for them? And then we end up with this interesting variation across countries.
Now, I also studied economics a long time ago. I'm primarily a political scientist, but I also studied economics. And every student who does economics, first year bachelor, I guess, will learn that free trade or trade among nations makes both sides always better off. And that's the famous concept of comparative advantage, which is an easy concept, but also very difficult to grasp for some people. Now, when we talk about sustainable trade and equitable trade and however you want to call it, it seems that we're often not talking so much about the facts than about perception. So it's about, do we perceive that to be fair, or also what kind of segments of society believe that they are benefiting from it? And that's also quite well known, is that a society or an economy as a whole may benefit, for example, from a free trade agreement, but you have certain sectors of the society who do not, and they tend to be very entrenched, very loud, very well organized. Is that also something that you're working on, taking into consideration that it's not always objective truth, but it's more about perceptions or maybe also psychological issues that are at hand here?
Yeah, I would say that the comparative advantage argument has two parts to it. So it says, in the long run, in the aggregate, across the largest number of us, trade is better than not trade. But there are two parts of that are important to remember. In the long run, we're all better off. But in the short run, we are not all better off. And even the way that we define better off is going to vary between you and me, whether we're domestic stakeholders or whether we're in different countries. So how we define the long run and how we are better off is open to debate and discussion. And so one of the things that was supposed to happen under trade and has been inconsistently applied is that there's supposed to be a mechanism that goes along with comparative advantage. Pure free trade results in some challenges, tensions that you just mentioned. What's supposed to happen is that governments are supposed to support transition from those in the short run who are less advantaged to some better position in the longer run, so that, again, we all benefit in the longer run. But between now and then, there are government supports or other kinds of support structures in place. Now, what those look like varies. It could be worker retraining. So I sit in Singapore, for example, and the government in Singapore is extremely forward-leaning on skills development, continuous across your lifetime skills development. And they've got an incredibly complicated series of coursework available for citizens of Singapore to constantly change the skill set that they currently have to be ready for the jobs of the future. Now, why do they do that? They do that because Singapore is incredibly trade exposed. So 300% trade to GDP ratio means that any kind of disruption in global trade creates real domestic issues. The government recognizes that if you just let trade do its thing without any sort of help, you would end up with people who do not benefit in the short run and who don't have time to wait for the long run benefits to flow through to them because, they could be dead by then. So the idea is, let's constantly upgrade our citizens in ways that allows them to get some of the benefits in the short run as well as in the long run from trade. Most governments don't do this as well. And so I think one of the reasons why trade has gotten problematic name in many markets is that kind of constant vigilance about short-run consequences from trade gets ignored. The other challenge we have is that it's very easy to blame trade for a lot of disruption, especially a lot of job losses, when it's actually not trade that's causing the disruption of the job losses, but especially over recent lifetimes, it's technology. And I assume that with the spread of something like AI, this will be on steroids. In other words, we're going to see a lot more job losses and disruption, and we will be more likely to blame it on trade than to blame it on some other thing, like, your obsession with an app on your phone. That's not something that goes down well with a domestic audience. So instead, you point fingers at outsiders and you say, if we didn't have trade, if those foreigners weren't messing with our market, we would be much better off now. So I think we have been in a challenging situation for trade in general, and it will likely get more challenging as these accelerated waves of technological shifts come through. It will put pressure on politicians in particular to think about how they address trade and economic openness.
We had a time beginning in the 1990s where the trajectory was seemingly unstoppable in the other direction. So it was more globalization, more trade. The question was really only the pace, right? How quick would it move forward? We had the creation of the WTO. There was, a lot of emphasis on big multilateral trade agreements. Now that has slowly changed. I think also not recently. It was a trend that started over time to the point where big global trade agreements nobody seems to be talking about them anymore. The WTO, some people say it's basically dead already, or at least it's kind of in a state of coma. But then beneath that, there's also a lot of other activity going on. And I would like to focus a little bit on Asia, especially because you mentioned Singapore, where you're based. And I think in Asia, there's quite a lot of activity when it comes to trade. There's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and then there's also quite a number of bilateral trade agreements that are taking place, have come into force over the past years. Is there a particular Asia free trade moment, maybe also in a way that is Asia decoupling a little bit in that sense from Europe, from North America, and the rest of the world?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I would say that this is a trade exposed part of the world, right? So if you think about how has most of Asia grown and developed over time, it's been on the basis of trade. So from the earliest days, I'm talking post-World War II here, we had a lot of rebirth in Asia as a result of export-led economic growth. That is important and has done an amazing job of giving people jobs and opportunities. And in most people's lifetimes across most of Asia, the transformation has been tremendous. So again, I sit in Singapore. It's very easy to meet older Singaporeans who remember the place when it was, of course, it was still important. It was a British colony. It was always fairly well connected to the rest of the global economy. But what it has had in the lifetime of the people who have lived here is this incredible explosion of growth and jobs, opportunities. Per capita incomes have skyrocketed. The amount of money that comes in and out of this island is extraordinary. Most of Asia is like that, maybe not quite as successful at it as Singapore has been, but basically across everyone's lifetimes, they recognize that trade has made a difference. That gives them generally more enthusiasm for trade than you find in places where you haven't in your personal lifetime experienced that kind of positive forward momentum where you have at least a sense that your children will be better off than you and their grandchildren will continue to be better off again. That pushes you to be much more open in general. And it also pushes governments to be far more collaborative in nature. So one of the things that has certainly kept me in Asia all this time is the enthusiasm for which governments in this region embrace collaboration and cooperation. And we see that literally every day, every month, there's a new trade initiative that is announced or delivered across this region, but not just within Asia. And one of the things that has been striking in the last year and a half, given the level of disruption coming out of Donald Trump's US, is the extent to which this region is also looking for other trade partners, including the European Union, for other kinds of trade and cooperation commitments, whether that's a big trade deal, which we're still doing in this part of the world, or whether that's smaller trade deals. And we just had one that was announced just a few days ago, actually, between Singapore and New Zealand on essential goods. So it's a much narrower, much more targeted kind of cooperation to make sure that both small economies stay open to one another in a time of crisis in a set of products that are important to both sides. In this case, it's fuel and food. But it could be anything. Like that general model, I think, could be applied to lots of different governments. That is interesting. And that integration, I think, does continue. So we're not decoupling as such. However, there are definitely changes in supply chains going across this region. There is less trade, depending on which market you're looking at, with the United States. There is a growing amount of trade with China, even though that can be challenging for many of the governments in the region. There is an enthusiasm for looking for alternative markets, including ones like Africa, which have really not been on the agenda for a lot of companies in Asia in the past, but are now becoming an important part of growth going forward.
Would you say that Asia is today the most trade-friendly region in the world? Is that a fair assessment?
I think there's actually a fair amount of enthusiasm across much of the developing world, not all of it, but much of the developing world. And I would point, this is not my area of expertise, but I would look at Africa, for example, which has not done a lot to trade with their neighbors for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into. But the point is that integration impulse across Africa does seem to be building momentum and accelerating. And I see similar kinds of things happening in Latin America, for example, where we might get more inter-Latin American trade, more trade with Latin America and Asia or other trade partners. So I think that despite the tensions that we are all facing for a variety of reasons, again, there is still a strong understanding that it is hard to make your way in this world as one isolated individual state, and that you are better off if you can cooperate and collaborate with like-minded partners, whoever they happen to be, in order to push an agenda that matters to you domestically, but also you with your trade partners.
You mentioned the trade agreement between Singapore and New Zealand, which is a bilateral and has a fairly narrow scope. Not long ago, among economists, those kind of deals, I think they were frowned upon almost, one could say. We don't want, first of all, we don't want bilateral deals. We don't want segment-focused deals. Ideally, we only want like big global WTO rounds that encompass ideally everything, right? Given that that is not very likely to happen again anytime soon, are you in favor of these little baby steps? Would you say it's better to do very, very limited mini advances than not to do anything and wait forever until miraculously we'll have another Doha round like WTO negotiation series?
Well, let me just say that the Singapore-New Zealand agreement they just reached on essential supplies actually is the seventh bilateral or the seventh arrangement between the two markets. So they have already an existing bilateral that is comprehensive. They've got an agreement between ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand that's now been upgraded twice. They're part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP countries. They're both part of RCEP, which you mentioned earlier, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They're now both part of the latest kid on the block, if you will, FITP, the Forum of Investment and Trade Partnership of Smaller Economies. They're going to have a ministerial in July. So they have a lot of arrangements between them. And this is just to sort of imagine it as sort of a chapter in a larger book of commitments. So I think that makes it slightly different. But I would say that the world is definitely getting more complicated. And it's getting more complicated in ways that are going to have real consequences for companies, because companies have been used to doing this global just-in-time, for example. They can't do that anymore, or they're less likely to be able to do that. They're going to have to think much harder about what am I doing, where am I doing it, why am I doing it, what are the risks to the model that I have, and what are the triggers that would make me change my mind. So if whatever it happens to be, price of oil goes up, the tariff goes up, the whatever, fill in the blank, what is the risk that a particular firm faces? What is that trigger point at which point we need to look for something else? So we're going to get a much more expensive and more complicated world. Eventually, I think we will all say this is stupid. Why do we have such a complicated world with all of these overlapping, inconsistent arrangements that are bilateral, that are regional, that are span the globe, but are weird actors together? This is dumb. We should go back and do something globally. So I think eventually we will end up back at something like the World Trade Organization, because we will all say this is crazy for us to have all of these inconsistent rules and standards and procedures, but we're not there right now. At this moment, the 166 members of the World Trade Organization literally, I think, could not order lunch if they wanted to order lunch because they couldn't agree on what they were going to eat. So until they can figure out how to order a menu that they can agree on, we are at a period of sort of holding up what they can of cooperation, using the venue as a sort of, think of it as a sort of overarching, tent for different kinds of meetings or clubs that happen inside of that building. If they could do that, that would be helpful, because it would be nice to keep the building, keep the infrastructure alive and working for the day when we all go, this is stupid, we should come back together as a global community and make some kind of global arrangements for trade.
Okay, I hear that you are optimistic, at least in the long run, when it comes to the prospects of global trade and trade agreements.
So I have done over the years, a lot of work on how do you get growth and economic development. There are lots of things that you can try that tend to deliver growth and jobs. But so far, the closest thing that I think we have to a one-size-fits-all kind of solution is trade. It gets you the furthest way down the path towards economic growth and development compared to any other alternatives. Now, that doesn't mean that trade alone gets you economic development, but I think it's an important part of that. And I do worry an awful lot about what happens if trade fragments to the prospects for developing economies, for the least developed economies, for marginalized communities inside of a society that are going to have a harder and harder time getting growth and economic benefits from whatever comes next. So on behalf of the part of the world that is most at risk, the most vulnerable, I would like us to return to some kind of global system. It is so much easier for a small, landlocked, developing country to be successful when there are global rules than to have to be part of some kind of bilateral or regional arrangement that provides benefits for them. Because no matter how you do this, you're likely to be the least important player in that grouping unless it's global. And so that means the benefits don't flow to you. You're not really driving the rules. The rules get done by the more powerful players in that group. That's a problem. So I think, again, sort of for the purposes of actually getting growth and development, we really need to have global rules in place as much as possible to protect the most vulnerable among us.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and especially because sometimes in the discussion, some people pretend that it's the other way around, that trade somehow abuses the developing countries, where in fact multilateral rules-based systems generally protect them from being bullied by bigger.
We're about to test
players.
that theory in a way that I think is going to be painful for all of us, right? We're about to see what happens when the law of the jungle really does seem to apply. And I would bet a very large amount of money on this, that the poorest, the most vulnerable will come out the worst. And that, I think, is really a sad, depressing outcome.
Oh, yeah.
So hopefully not. Hopefully we can get people to think a bit more collaboratively about this. But it's very hard. I mean, particularly think about if you're a small developing country in a neighborhood that is dysfunctional, what do you do? Because as I say often with people on trade agreements in particular, not everybody's a very attractive dance partner, right? That not everyone wants to sign a bilateral with you because sometimes there's just not much that you have to offer. And so what happens to those countries that aren't attractive dance partners, especially if their region is dysfunctional? They really struggle. And so again, I'm worried a lot about what happens on development in general and what happens to those vulnerable economies.
I think that's a very, very important point that we also see now with the latest disruptions, I guess, when it comes to trade disruptions due to violent conflict, for example, inflation goes up, etc. I would like to move to another area that I know that you care about and you work on, which is digital trade and data governance. Now, this is obviously a very important, fast-growing part of most countries' economies, but it's also, when it comes to international trade rules, I guess one of the areas that is least governed or least regulated, maybe also because it is still relatively new compared to the physical trade of goods. So let's start with a definition. When we talk about digital trade, what do we mean by that? Is that e-commerce? Is that the app economy? What do we mean by that?
I think it started out where people imagined that digital trade meant I order a book on Amazon and the physical book comes to my house. So straight up e-commerce. Then, of course, Amazon started delivering digital copies of that book to your device. And people got a bit more confused about what we meant by digital trade if it wasn't straight up e-commerce, buy a hard copy of something and it comes to you. Now it's even more complicated because I would argue on what is digital trade. I would challenge people to think of something that is not digital. Imagine any kind of trade of any kind of good, service, investment, people movement, whatever it is that has nothing digital attached to it. I don't think it's possible. So now then it becomes a really unhelpful definition, frankly, because if everything is digital trade, then nothing is digital trade. I'm not sure where we are in this definitional issue. But if you talk about like what are governments thinking about when they say digital trade, they're still probably potentially 20 years behind where business actually is in the digital space. And we are still talking about things like data flows, data localization. In other words, where is the data held? What kind of data can move? What kind of data is personal data? What kind of data is not personal data? And again, I would say, like, I understand where this comes from. And I understand you've got government officials who are really grappling with fast-moving issues. And again, they don't talk to business that often. So they have a hard time understanding the extent to which their kind of neat divisions of the world into this is this and this is that really doesn't work, especially in the digital economy. So let's just start with something like personal data. Again, I would challenge you, describe to me what is not personal data. Almost everything that you can imagine, increasingly, I think, has got personal data in it. Now, of course, we can say, did the wind turbine blow? Did the turbine itself spin? That's not personal data. Okay, fair enough. Where did that power or electricity that was generated go? Ultimately goes to my house, which has got my address, which ultimately could be my personal data. I use this amount of wind power today. Now, you might say, well, I don't actually care about where it goes. All I care about is whether the turbine moved, and that's really the focus for me. So, okay, maybe we can have some kinds of data that are detached, physically detached from personal data, but I just think it's very hard to do. And we're creating rules that I think are problematic because ultimately, if personal data gets mingled with not personal data, how do we split them apart? How do you ask a company to do this? I especially worry for small businesses. If you're a small business, and you're told that you're only allowed to collect non-personal data, then you say, well, I might as well go out of business because I'm selling to you. You have a name, you have an address, you have a bank account, presumably, or some way that you're paying me. How do I not have personal data transferring across borders? If you're going to order something or buy something from overseas, personal data moves. So I think we're at the early stages still, even though we've been at this for decades, of figuring out how do we manage digital trade. Is it similar to or different from regular trade? If it's different, what's different? And then you layer on that all of the technological developments, including the really big ones like AI. And what are we going to do in an AI-generated world? We are way behind that, I would argue, on the government and regulatory side. It's just challenging to get companies to describe what they're actually doing in a way that makes sense to governments, and for governments to say, these are the actual risks and priorities that we ought to have. And then what is our own domestic policy? And then how might we align that with others? It's still super complicated and early days.
I'm based in Europe, and I think one area where Europeans are really far ahead, and whether it's a positive thing or a negative, we can discuss that in a moment, is when it comes to regulation. I think we are fairly advanced there. Also, most Europeans or most European countries have a strong emphasis on data protection, the things that you mentioned. So there is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which I think has been in existence for about 10 years or even more now. We more recently have the Digital Markets Act, and we also have an AI Act. The European Union being the first area, I think, in the world trying to attempt to regulate this fast-moving area. What's your assessment of that? Are those regulations helpful, or are they quite on the opposite, impediments? Because a lot of people also in Europe, especially businesses, say that Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot with overwhelming regulation, because the only effect that it has is that companies working in those fields, such as AI, for example, move elsewhere. There is no innate kind of originally European technology left, and then Europeans, the only thing they can do is license, for example, American or Chinese technology. So is that a good sign in the sense that there is a strong appetite for healthy regulation and also maybe sovereignty? Or is it, on the other extreme, something that is only hurting the own economies?
I think regulation is a good impulse for governments. I mean, we have governments for a reason. And one of the reasons why we have government is they're supposed to help citizens manage risk. And you want to make sure that your citizens are not unduly exposed to risks, whether that's content that's inappropriate for minors, children, whether that's the risks of senior citizens getting scammed and having their life savings drained overnight or whatever, right? So there's some risks that I would argue, yes, government should absolutely be across these issues. The challenge is like, well, how do we get there? And so let me just talk about the personal data protection for a minute. You know, one of the solutions in Europe to personal data protection is you're supposed to opt in to the sharing of your personal data. The net result of that is every website, every time you open a tab, it comes up with a thing that says, do you agree? And I would challenge you to find the number of people who click no, because as soon as you click no, now you're not able to engage with the world like the rest of us. You are basically, you know, in a shack in a side of the lake or something. I don't know where you are if you say no to these things. That's not really protecting anyone's data, in my mind. So this is a regulation, well-intentioned. And again, I understand where it comes from. But I think we have to be careful that we are not creating performative regulations, i.e., click a box and therefore you have given me your permission, not only today, but potentially infinitely given me your permission, but not strangled us in constantly having to give your permission to do things. And as you think about the world going forward, an example I often give is, your refrigerator. If your refrigerator has the ability to keep track of what's in it, let's say, and note that, imagine that your milk is expiring, do I have to personally say to my refrigerator, it's okay with me that you know that that I'm about to have expired milk, and to tell me about it, right? Like, this just gets nonsensical. I couldn't even get out of bed in the morning if I had to authorize my refrigerator every single day to tell me what is in it. So you have to be very thoughtful about what kinds of regulations you're putting in place. And you need to be open, and this is the challenge that I get the Europeans really struggle with. You have to be open to changing them. So you can have a regulation that makes perfect sense at this date and time, but you would also have to be equally open to reassessing that on a regular basis and making adjustments. Europe is a bit less comfortable with the unregulating. And I understand why, because it is such a tedious process to get all of the European Union together on a set of regulations that once you've accomplished that, the last thing you want to do is open it up again and say, are we sure this is what we want to do? But this is a world in which technology is changing fast. And if you lock yourself into rules that made sense a decade ago in a technology space, that could be problematic as well. And you may be, as you just mentioned, driving innovation out. You may not be driving innovation out. One thing I will absolutely say from Asia's perspective, looking at Europe, especially from Asian business perspective, looking at Europe, Europe is a nightmare to do business with. And it's a nightmare to do business with for so many reasons, but one of them is that the regulations are aimed, no surprise, at European businesses in Europe doing business in Europe. Those might be possible to comply with easily in Europe, right? So if I'm a European business supplying in Europe, whatever it is, goods, service, whatever, it's manageable. But if you are not, if you are outside of Europe trying to supply something to a European market, the complexity is super high, the costs are incredibly high, and the gap between often local regulations in similar kinds of areas and what the European Union demands is like night and day. And it creates real challenges for companies that want to do more business with the Europeans and potentially for European companies to do business outside of Europe, because by definition, European costs are much higher because you have to comply with all of that regulatory stuff. And so then your costs when you go overseas are just much higher.
I guess you're right. The problem I see with regulation is that regulation always trails reality. So there's kind of a new reality, something changes, and then regulations comes afterwards. So it regulates basically after the fact. Now with AI, with the extreme speed at which things are developing, is that even possible? Because we might have to revise regulation on a daily basis. And I'm not exaggerating, because we know that we may be talking here for an hour, and maybe some company came up with a new algorithm, a new language model that is capable of doing something that wasn't possible yesterday. Is that even possible? And some people also say, well, if we cannot regulate it because things are moving so fast, well, let's just not regulate and let's, assume the risks basically, or fix things afterwards if something breaks.
Or ban it.
Or ban it.
So
yeah,
another solution is to just ban it. We're not going to have this. I think one of the challenges with regulation today, particularly in the digital space, is you have to be far more clear about what is the behavior that you are trying to address. So you could say, for example, on a regulatory basis, keeping in mind that I am not actually a regulator myself, so I'm sure some regulators will be choking on their coffee when they hear this. But I would say if the regulation is to avoid showing content that is problematic to children under the age of 12, whatever that is, you figure out what that age cap is. You have to say the goal here of this regulation is to avoid showing this kind of content to this kind of citizen. And then potentially you have to leave it at that. So it's really more of a regulation around the intent rather than around the specifics. Because if you try to regulate around specifics, what a platform may or may not show, or for example, what kind of platform, or I have no idea, but I could imagine some regulator getting excited about, like, you can only show it once in 24 hours or whatever, fill in the blank, what is the parameters? The more specific you get about the regulation, the more you potentially strangle businesses, but also you potentially avoid the point of the regulation in the first place, which was, I don't want this kind of content shown to children. And because you have so carefully regulated it, you may have made it easier, actually, to show some kinds of content than others to exactly this population, because they could say, well, I fit within the narrow confines of the regulation and I'm still doing it. So I think we have to change a bit in this fast-moving space. What are the problems that we're trying to address? And then think much more holistically about how we regulate. But that's not going to be very satisfying for a lot of people either. And as you mentioned, again, if the models are changing every week, that is really hard for regulators to keep up with. And so we have to create much more nimble ways of regulating. That is not typical for governments, especially, think about it, like if you are the kind of person who is a regulator, by definition, you like rules. You like consistency. You like having order. You like structure, right? That's why you became a regulator. If you weren't that, you would go, be a rock star or something, right? So there's the kind of person who regulates is not the kind of person who is comfortable with uncertainty, with flexibility, with some kind of, let's see what happens, an outcome. And I think that's part of the challenge we have in the regulatory space, especially, is we have empowered people who like regulation to regulate in a world in which we might need people who are a bit more sort of flexible, prepared to wait, prepared to act quickly when they discover a risk, because that's also an issue, right? And
Yeah.
I don't know what that balance is, but it is hard.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think actually that's something that you could probably apply to many sectors as well, is that some of the difficulties arise from, there's a reason why you are attracted to a certain field of profession, and that may create some issues down the line. One thing that I really want to talk about is security, because especially in Europe, but I think also in other parts of the world, trade, whether it be digital, fully digital, or traditional trade with physical goods changing hands and traveling across borders, it is increasingly seen through a security lens. And we see that particularly when it comes to IT, of course. There are worries in Europe and also in the US that, for example, TikTok may be used by the Chinese government to either eavesdrop on citizens in those regions or to manipulate them through specific algorithms that emphasize specific content at the expense of other content. We also see that when it comes to infrastructure, a lot of discussion in Europe and the US going on about whether or not to allow Chinese companies to supply parts for mobile networks, for example, so switches and servers and stuff like that. Recently, apparently, the Norwegians found out that some electric buses that they had purchased from China, they could be switched off remotely from China. Will that change trade as well, in the sense that it's now not only an economic discussion, what we had earlier, who benefits from it, which segments of the society are better off or worse off, but it's now plainly seen in military security perspectives?
So I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. So one is the interaction between trade and security to become everything becomes an economic security discussion. Certainly that is true in the US and true to a greater extent in Europe. Those kinds of discussions are not very common in Asia, partly because a lot of Asian governments, this is generalizing across a very complicated set of economies, but a lot of Asian governments would say, first of all, security is, of course it's important to us, but at the end of the day, nobody's going to invade us and we're not going to stop an invasion. Like, security is a different problem. And they would say, our interest is less focused on the security risk of turning off buses. What we really want is a bus. So if you're going to provide us with an electric bus that would help us reduce our reliance on Middle Eastern oil, fantastic. And if you would do that at a price point that we can afford, even better. So this discussion about security is very different in Asia. Again, it depends on which market, but generally speaking, it is just much less prominent. So I think the first thing to recognize is that economic security is different or seen differently. And we also have a really unusual situation in Asia, I think, where, you could say, yeah, the Chinese have certain challenges to economic security, but they're not the only challenge that Asia faces. Increasingly, they put the United States into some of that same bucket, and that is a very new set of developments that I think is yet to play out. So we don't worry as much about economic security. Who is the problem in economic security is, I think, a bit more contested, a bit less clear, especially remember that China is the largest market for every single government in Asia, exports and imports.
Yeah.
So, and they're in the neighborhood. So, your enthusiasm for confronting China is not nearly the same. So that's the sort of second point I would make on economic security. But you do point to a really important challenge, which is around technology specifically, that is going to create real problems in Asia. Because up until now, Asia has generally sort of said, and again, it's a big space, not everyone agrees completely, but they basically said, we want to get along with everybody. We export to the globe. We're going to continue to export to the globe. That requires us to import from the globe in order to get the raw materials, parts, components we need in order to make the thing or deliver the service. We're going to continue that. That sort of tightrope between dealing with China and the US, for example, has been narrowing. But when you start talking about technology, it might not even be possible to be on a tightrope. You might have to say, we are going to align our technology stack on American technology or on Chinese technology, but it is too complicated and too expensive for us to have both. You can't have both. You would have to design two separate systems for two separate purposes. And I think that is a problem that is coming faster than people imagine and will create problems for companies because you will have to decide from the beginning which technology stack do we want to use? And I suspect that the sort of ability to pick and choose between different kinds of technology could get narrower and narrower such that you are locked in. You are either in a sort of US orbit of tech or a China orbit of tech. There might eventually be some sort of third party. I don't know what that would look like. Maybe it's centered on the EU. I don't know. But I think that the technology, again, if everything becomes digital, then the technology matters more than ever. How are we going to sort that one out? I don't think we have any idea yet.
Very interesting point. I was wondering, you said, well, countries have to decide or companies have to decide which camp they want to belong to. Could it not also be that we will get to a situation where small countries, Singapore being one of them, will be forced or will be put under pressure by, for example, both the US and China to say, well, Singapore, you're a tiny country. You have so far been able to manage good relations with both sides very smartly and, playing along nicely. But now, we've come to the point where you have to choose. Are you with us or are you with the others? And what will that mean, for example, for a country such as Singapore, which in the end is a tiny little dot.
Little red dot, yeah.
I think the Singaporean government is probably playing its cards very well so far, but in the end, they're also at the mercy to a certain extent from large players who dominate the sphere. And in a world that is increasingly polarized, where it's increasingly you be with us or you're with the others, what might that mean in the future? Is that really a choice, the Chinese stack or the US stack, that they will be able to take, or will they be forced to side with one of those?
It's a great
powers?
question. We have seen Singaporean leaders in the last few years have been saying more and more vocally, don't make us choose. Don't make us choose. Don't make us choose. Now, part of that was because they don't want to be put in that position. Part of that was because I suspect you might not like the answer to which choice we make. So I think there was a little bit of that. But one of the things that has also been striking in the last couple of months even, so literally since the beginning of this year and certainly accelerated with the war in Iran, Singaporean leaders have been much more vocal in arguing against the US publicly and potentially in favor of China. And I think their argument is ultimately, again, we don't want to choose. Let's just be clear. We don't want to choose. There are real benefits from being in between. We've always been in between. We're not hostile to anybody. But if we have to choose, then you're going to put us in a situation that, again, may not be what you want, US, may be more what China wants. I don't know. But it's very awkward and uncomfortable for Singapore. If I look out of our office windows, for example, the view in front of us is a mix of Singaporean companies, but foreign companies, including increasingly Chinese companies that have been set up here, headquartered here, et cetera. That's Singapore's traditional stance. That could get untenable. And it could get untenable faster than people imagine. And again, it creates real challenges. So I'm not saying that a company or even a government sort of wakes up on a Tuesday and says, today is the day we're going to pick a side and we're going to stick to it. But I think it's an accumulation of smaller decisions that ultimately end up showing which camp you're in. I don't think you're planting a flag necessarily. We are with you, we are against you. It's just a series of decisions that get made. And ultimately, when you look across the thing, you say, actually, most of our companies are built on X, this tech stack or that tech stack, for example, or all of our investment dollars look like this and not like that, or whatever it happens to be. So I think it's not so much a clear choice as much as it is evolution of decision-making that results in something. That is so uncomfortable. I mean, that's uncomfortable, of course, for governments. It's uncomfortable for businesses. It's uncomfortable for citizens who are trying to figure out, where do I fit within this? What are the options that we have? And again, I think that is, first of all, depressing. I don't want to be in a world that has to choose either, just to be clear, but also, problematic, especially given where we were not that long ago, where, you felt like the world was flat and you could sort of do anything. And now suddenly the world is no longer flat. What are we going to do about that?
A bold prediction. The world in 10 years.
A bold prediction is our segment where we ask our guests to bring their crystal balls and look into the future. Deborah, what do you think? Where will we be in 10 years from now?
It's going to be much more fragmented and much more expensive. I think firms are not yet prepared for the level of complexity that they're about to face and the costs of that complexity. And so we will be in a much more fragmented, smaller world than the world that we're used to being in.
Executive briefing. What you should read now.
Executive briefing is another segment of our show. We always ask our guests to bring a few recommendations on what people might read if they want to know more, if they want to dive a little bit deeper into the topics that we've addressed today. What would your executive briefing recommendations be, Deborah?
Well, I would have, I guess, 3. 1, obviously, you should subscribe to the Hinrich Foundation. Every week we put out a newsletter. It has a variety of things that are trade-related. 2 is an outfit in Europe, led out of Europe, the Global Trade Alert. I think is interesting because it's very data-driven. So if you want to know what the actual data shows, for example, on Chinese overcapacity, they have the data to show you that, in fact, it's a smaller problem than you imagine. It's concentrated in a few sectors and not others. And so I think data-driven discussions, super important. I suggest the Global Trade Alert for that purpose. They have a companion one called Digital Trade Alert for those interested in digital trade. And then a third suggestion that I would make is something called geopolitical dispatch. This is a really interesting approach taken by a number of ex-government officials who put together, it's 5 pieces per day, but they're very short. And they basically are the equivalent of a sort of president or prime minister's intelligence brief. Doesn't recap the news, just for people who are feeling overwhelmed by news. It just says, here is a topic, here's what you need to know about it, and here's how it affects business. So it's not a recap of what's actually happened, but it gives you 5 areas of business focus that I think you don't get elsewhere. And so I would recommend Geopolitical Dispatch for that purpose.
Very good. They all sound very interesting. And as always, we will put the links to those publications in the show notes so that people can look them up there and then obviously subscribe to them.
Great.
Deborah, we've come to the end of this episode. It was very, very insightful, very complex topic. I think we've only been able to scratch on the surface, but that's how it is always in these episodes. Very dynamic as well. So let's see how these events play out. Hopefully the more optimistic of your assessments will prevail in the long run. And we would love to have you back at some point to reassess what we've discussed today and maybe dive a little bit deeper on some of the other issues.
Happy to be back anytime.
Great. Thank you very much. This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the German Maritime Center. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.